Now, the concept of well-being is the theme for today's lecture. Okay, so well-being is typically, I would think, associated with physical or mental, psychological health, and overall life satisfaction. Now, although language should be a contributing factor, not many scholars have addressed the integral or essential role of language plays in our well-being. And with the increasing number of interlingual families or bilingual families, multilingual families around the globe, we feel the importance of addressing this issue. And today we are extremely pleased, happy, and honored, excited to welcome Professor Dr. Annick Houwer, a renowned researcher in the field of bilingualism, multilingualism, especially family bilingualism, to our campus in Tokyo to give an open lecture on this topic for everyone. Okay. Here, let me give a brief introduction of our speaker. Okay. So Dr. Annick Houwer is the director of the Harmonious Bilingualism Network, Professor Emerita of Language Acquisition Multilingualism at the University of Erfurt, Germany. And she also currently serves as the president of the International Association for the Study of Child Language, IASCO. Okay. Now, after being trained in linguistics at universities in Belgium and at Stanford University, Professor de Houwer held professional positions at universities of Antwerp and Brussels in Belgium, and also at the University of Erfurt in Germany. Dr. de Houwer's research has focused on the linguistic and social-psychological aspects of bilingual and monolingual language development. And as most of you must be aware of, she has served as the series editor of, for example, Trends in Bilingual, Trends in Language Acquisition Research. Okay. And for example, okay, or has co-edited several volumes, including the Cambridge Handbook of Bilingualism. And she has also disseminated fundamental knowledge about bilingual first language acquisition through authoring books such as The Acquisition of Two Languages from Birth, a case study, or Bilingual Development in Childhood, the most recent one published in 2021, just to name a few. And today, Professor de Houwer will deliver a lecture under the title, Well-Being for Bilinguals, a focus on bilingual language development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Annick de Houwer.
Sorry, I have to turn on my microphone. Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Professor Satomi Mori. And I would also like to thank everybody here present for coming. And I would like to thank everybody who's watching online. I'm trying to get to my next slide here, but it's not working. Let me see, maybe this way. No, so I don't know what's going on. Sorry, but I also want to thank, of course, Rikkyo University and the, sorry, let me find out how to do it. How did you do that?
I think that
I'm just going to test it now, briefly. Going back, going forward, yes. Thank you so much. Magic. Thank you so much. So I also want to thank the College of Intercultural Communication and the St. Paul's Institute of English Language Education for the gracious invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here in person and to speak to people also who are really present, live. That's great. And so anybody who has any questions about references or other questions later on, who doesn't feel, when there's no time for questions afterwards perhaps, please feel free to email me at the address that you see on the screen. Now, early child bilingualism is really a very widespread global phenomenon, And for Japan, so I found this beautiful image of Japan. I think it's gorgeous. Like so many other things in Japan are really super gorgeous. We were talking even about the sewer covers. Yes, if you haven't paid attention, pay some attention. They're really, in Japan, wonderful. So, but in Japan, there's no statistics on how many children grow up with multiple languages. But many primary school children are learning English, I think, as a foreign language. And surely there are many children who hear another language than Japanese at home, but we really don't know much about it. Now, many parents globally, and that includes Japanese parents outside Japan, so many parents globally and in Japan do raise their children in a bilingual environment. And parents, well, they may have questions, they may have concerns about how their children will be able to deal with that bilingual setting. And I think in any case, parents will want overall well-being for their children and their families, yeah, everywhere. So harmonious bilingualism is presumably what parents and families want, and I've written about that extensively starting in 2006. So what is it, harmonious bilingualism? Well, it refers to a sense of subjective well-being and satisfaction that families in a language contact, in a bilingual situation, experience. And not only that sense of subjective well-being, but in the absence of negative experiences that people think are due to the bilingual situation. And I think that having realistic expectations that are based on solid research will help parents to manage the bilingual setting. Many parents, however, are caught unawares by aspects of their children's bilingual development, either because they have implicit assumptions that made them expect other things, so they thought things were different than they really are, or because they just weren't thinking much about the bilingual setting, which, you know, raising young children, having babies, as some of you here know, is very tiring, and you don't have much time to really reflect on things. But let's take a look here. For instance, without any science-based knowledge, how would you react in the following situation, where we meet up with Kenji there, who lives in the United States, with his Japanese origin father and his American origin mother, and he hears Japanese and English at home. But by age 2, he's not speaking at all. So he's not saying words, he's not combining 2 words into one sentence as by age 2 we really would expect. So it is clearly a language delay that Kenji is showing. He's not doing anything in either language. And well, the parents are concerned. And so they go and see the pediatrician. And the pediatrician thinks that Kenji is language delayed because he is hearing 2 languages. So that's because there's this myth going around that a bilingual environment in and of itself leads to problems in children's language development, and that it is just too difficult for young children, yes? Now, this myth has been around for a long time, and it's still there, but the fact is that a bilingual environment presents absolutely no threat to children's language development. And I'll try to explain a little bit of that in the coming hour. Bilingual language development in the first decade of life, that's what I'll focus on. And I'm also going to focus just on spoken language. But of course, some children grow up with both oral and signed speech, or in fact, even with 2 signed languages, but here the research base is still very thin, and it's too early to make any general pronouncements as far as I'm concerned. Also, my main focus is on languages that children absolutely need in their daily lives. So I'm not going to talk about foreign language acquisition. In fact, I'll be talking more about that in a few days at another university here close by. So, and when I talk about bilingual, like my co-editor Lourdes Ortega and I did in the handbook, the Cambridge Handbook of Bilingualism, and as I've done all my career, basically, I use the term bilingual to refer to the use of more than one language or language variety, and that could be 3, 4, and so on. So again, the research base for situations involving more than 2 languages is still very thin, although that's being rectified by the minute, thankfully. And today I will focus on situations involving just 2 languages. And the main source is the book that was already mentioned by Professor Mishina Mori, namely Bilingual Development in Childhood, which came out in 2021. Now, there are, in fact, 4 different bilingual language learning environments for children under age 11, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. So there's bilingual first language acquisition, BFLA, where 2 languages, so I use L for language. 2 languages are heard at home from birth. And typically that's the later school language and another language. In early second language acquisition, or ESLA, there is 1 language at home from birth that is not the later school language. And before age 6, children start to be immersed in a second language, which is the school language, so the preschool language, through daycare or preschool. And it's also going to be the later language at primary school. So that's for children before age 6. And then there is second language acquisition, SLA, where like the ESLA children, there's only 1 language at home from birth that is not the later school language, but children only start to be immersed in the school language after age 6. So typically this happens in children who immigrate to another country after age 6, when they're older, and then they get kind of dropped into this new environment through school. And what is also why this age 6 age, it could be 5, it could be 7, but what's really important here is that in second language acquisition, children are not only expected to learn to speak, to understand and speak this new language, but also to read and write in it, which for children under age 6 is not the case. And then, of course, there's foreign language acquisition, which I won't cover anymore, but I just want to mention it, that there's also a learning environment, a bilingual learning environment, namely at preschool or school. Any BFLA, ESLA, or SLA child, and also any monolingual child, of course, starts to have classes teaching in a foreign language, and the foreign language is not usually needed or much heard outside the school environment. Okay, so let's go back to BFLA and ESLA, BFLA on the one hand and ESLA or SLA on the other. In fact, the estimate based on just a couple of surveys that can give us information about it is that in Western countries, BFLA occurs 3 times more frequently. So it's far more common for children to hear the school language and another language X at home rather than just another language X. Although often people, who talk about bilingual children, they appear to think, well, it's all just children who are learning a new language in the preschool or school environment. Well, that's not the case. That's not the most common case. So we have 2 surveys from Belgium, my own, and in the United States by Adam Winsler and colleagues, where remarkably we find pretty much identical proportions of BFLA and ESLA or SLA families. So we can't, based on those surveys, we cannot make a distinction between ESLA or SLA, but we can make a distinction between the 2 languages from birth or not 2 languages from birth. Okay, so these different bilingual language learning environments, for children, they lead to basically different language learning trajectories, different trajectories of language use for children under age 10 or 11. And of course, they all have a different personal experience with bilingualism and both languages. And it's also a different experience for families, not just for the children, whether children are growing up in a BFLA or an ESLA or SLA environment. And BFLA compared to ESLA, well, families have different connections and experiences. Most BFLA families, they have emotional, cultural, family connections with both languages, and they want their children to speak both at home. Whereas for most ESLA or SLA families, there is a strong emotional, cultural, and family connection with just a single language, X. And there's little engagement at home with the L2 or the school language. So often that's the majority language, and no expectation that children speak that L2 at home, but just the LX. That's the expectation and the desire, really. And there are also very different outcomes for these different expectations. In BFLA families, well, in 70% of BFLA families, children speak both languages, which means that in 30% of them, 30, children speak just a single language. And compare that and contrast that with ESLA families, where in just 3% of those, children do not speak the L1 by the time they reach are in primary school. But in 97% of those families, children do speak their L1. And so for BFLA, the expectations, well, the outcomes go against the expectations for nearly 1/3 of families. That's huge. Whereas in ESLA, well, most often the expectations are matched by the outcomes, which doesn't mean there are no exceptions. And of course, basically these data come from my own survey, and so far that's the only large survey that exists that can give us information about this. But there are several surveys across the globe, which I've also described and reviewed together. So data from Australia, Canada, Europe, United States, and across the globe, we find that as many as 1/4 to 1/5 of children who grow up with multiple languages, so they hear multiple languages, 2 or maybe even 3, they speak only a single language, the school language. And so for many people, that's a big surprise. Yeah. Now what happens if children speak only a single language, in spite of the fact that parents are speaking to them in another language? Well, it may be impossible for these children to communicate with grandma, grandpa, family, friends who speak that language that their parents speak. Yeah, this is very sad. Then also communication between parents and children may be negatively affected. And both parents and children may feel a sense of loss of identity, culture, emotional bonding. So important for parent-child relationship to have good emotional bonding. If not there, then when and where? So, and when they become young adults, children may be very angry with their parents for not making sure that they grew up speaking the parental language. And Janice Nakamura has called this language regret. Very important. Okay. So all these things detract from people's subjective well-being, and they're in the way of harmonious bilingualism. Now, luckily, we have research that shows that many children around the world are able to speak 2 languages fluently from early on, and that well-developed proficiency in 2 languages strengthens and supports the well-being and the social integration of children who are growing up bilingually. And also, especially for ESLA and SLA children, higher levels of proficiency in emergent bilingual children's first language support their developing proficiency in the second language. Now, I'm here, I don't know what the time is, Raoul, let me check. Okay, yeah, I think I will skip the next slide because it goes a little bit in too much detail, and I'll skip the other one also because I really want to get to the main points of my talk actually. So, you can see I did the work. Yes, and you know I'm happy to share this with you if you want to have the details, okay? And I want to get to my overview slide here, where I'm comparing BFLA and ESLA and SLA children once they get to primary school. And I'm here briefly comparing their language proficiency in a very general sense. So what little evidence there is suggests the following. And when I say what little evidence, that's because we don't have that many studies that tell us about this from ESLA or SLA children in primary school, because very often researchers do not make a distinction. They do not describe how the children that they study became bilingual, whether they are BFLA children or ESLA children or SLA children. So in that sense, it's very difficult then to figure out what's going on. Anyway, here is my attempt, and it's really important to make a distinction between the non-school language, whichever that may be, so this language that is not used at school or in the wider community, and the school language. And also let's look at both comprehension and production, because both of them are important, understanding and speaking. So for BFLA children at primary school, for the non-school language, well, many children understand the non-school language pretty well, but there are also apparently many that do less so, yeah? Now in production, for the non-school language, many BFLA children are doing okay, but as I already mentioned previously, many do not speak it at all, yeah? So there is, of course, between when I say many okay and many zero, there's all this range of variation in proficiency. What about the school language? Well, for BFLA children, that's doing mostly fine, and the knowledge is increasing both in comprehension and production, yeah? And very often these children also are indistinguishable from monolingual children who've only heard that language from birth, the school language. Let's go to ESLA children. For the non-school language, the comprehension, you know, it's likely fine. When I say likely, really, we really don't know much about it, because there's starting to be more and more research on what is called heritage language use in children. I really personally do not like that term, but I won't go into that now. But anyway, there's a lot more work now, very recently, paying attention to children's first language, yeah, in ESLA situations or SLA situations. And so for comprehension, well, it's generally likely fine. In production, many children they seem to be doing, by the time they're in primary school, fine, speaking their L1, but there's also reports of many children who don't speak it so well. And then for the school language, well, they're getting there, and they're increasing their proficiency gradually, as all children do, continue to learn, but they're getting there. But it's really they're not doing as well as the BFLA children. After all, the ESLA children started later, and there are many different factors that go into that. Then the SLA children, they're already much older when they get to deal with the second language, or when they get to hear the second language at school. They're fine. They've already had at least 6 years of really learning just that one single language at home, and they're doing fine in terms of comprehension and production. We really don't have that many reports that suggest otherwise. And the school language, well, they're just starting out, many of them. They started at age 6 or 7 or 8, and they're rapidly improving. And they're speed of learning this new language is in general much faster than for the ESLA children when they were younger, when they were under age 6. That's so far, that's how it is. Maybe this picture will change with more research. So there are some similarities here also that I want to mention, that all bilingual children may use utterances that combine words from 2 languages, and I've always called those mixed utterances, regardless of what elements were being mixed or combined. And so my term mixed utterances is supposed to be theoretically neutral, basically. Then bilingual children who speak 2 languages, they're able to fluently switch from one to the other. That seems to be nothing really hard to learn. And then attrition or loss of a language is possible for any bilingual child. And with regular exposure to the school language, all typically developing bilingual children, so children without any hearing problems or neurological problems, they eventually end up speaking the school language, but at variable levels of proficiency, yes. And that goes against many media reports, at least in the United States and Europe or North America, where people are very often saying that children do not learn the school language. Well, it's not true, they do. Yes, and uneven development, a term I first used in 2002, so across languages, so where the languages develop at a different pace, that is absolutely normal. Yeah. Still, there's a great heterogeneity amongst bilingual children in the first decade of life, depending on when and where they started regularly hearing their languages for day-to-day use. And it's really important to recognize this heterogeneity, both in clinical practice, in educational practice, and in research. And I really would call all researchers to document much more carefully the language learning histories of the children that they are studying. And especially the fundamental difference between BFLA and ESLA in infancy and early childhood, those differences need to be taken into account much more than they are. Well, and then there is the question, what's with then the well-being for these child bilinguals? Remember that harmonious bilingualism basically refers to well-being in bilingual settings. And there's more and more evidence that harmonious bilingualism stands a good chance if there is a general acceptance and a positive recognition of the fact that children are growing up with 2 or more languages. Now, unfortunately, that's really not always the case. Very often there are negative attitudes towards early child bilingualism, towards a specific family language, and it's either the parents or relatives that may hold negative attitudes, pediatricians, as already mentioned before, childcare workers, teachers, family, friends. There may also be a general negative attitude in society. Even researchers may hold negative attitudes, researchers of bilingualism. So that's tough to deal with, and this is not easy to work with. Now, linguistically determined lack of well-being at school or preschool occurs when children don't understand the school language, when children are unable to use the languages or language they already know to make themselves understood. So, or when children experience an explicit rejection of a language they bring to the classroom from home. So the first two cases, that's not so much for BFLA children, but mostly for ESLA children who are kind of dropped into this new language and who don't understand a word of what's being said. Also, children experience that the language they bring to class from home is worth less than the school language. That definitely is the case for many BFLA children, where they notice that only this other language that they hear at home, only that language is given any attention and is being used. And children who try to speak the school language in ESLA or SLA cases, well, they're implicitly rejected in their attempts to actually use it or not supported. So changing attitudes is really not easy. We need constant communication with the public at large to talk about the realities of child bilingualism in order to counter many myths that still are so present. And, you know, as a researcher who has been working with bilingual families now for 45 years, I suppose. Yes. It's amazing how always the same negative attitudes continue and continue and continue. And luckily, we do have a research that can speak to those myths now. But anyway, this is one of the reasons that I initiated the Harmonious Bilingualism Network. But of course, if deep-seated discrimination is at the root of negative attitudes, you can't do much as an individual. Now, luckily, attitudes aren't everything. There are many factors that you can control that foster well-being in bilingual children. So back to harmonious bilingualism. Also, it arises when children who regularly hear 2 or more languages, when they speak both of them well. This contributes to the well-being of both parents and children. And how do we get to that place where children speak 2 languages? Well, here it's parental home language choice patterns that can explain a lot. And I showed this in a paper from 2007 that by now I think is my most frequently cited publication. It's being cited for everything. You know, people say bilingualism is black, the Houwer 2007. Bilingualism is white, the Houwer 2007. But anyway, this is what I'm showing you now. That's the core of that paper, based on a survey of about 1,800 families, bilingual families. So within those families, dual parent families, the 5 logically possible patterns, language choice patterns, exist. We find them there. So both parents could be speaking just the non-school language at home. Also, both parents could be speaking the non-school language at home, and then one parent in addition speaks the school language at home. So that's a bilingual family then. The previous family is not a bilingual family because they speak just one language at home, right? Excuse me. And then we have the families where both parents speak both languages at home. Then we have the supposed one parent, one language families, where one parent speaks the school language and the other parent speaks the other language. And then we have the pattern where both parents speak the school language at home, and in addition, one parent, the X language. Now, these are color-coded, and you'll see why. Because here you'll see the success rate of each pattern. And so the top two patterns, which are green with the 97% and the 93%, and there's no statistical difference between those two, so it's pretty much the same, except, in one type of family is monolingual and the other type is bilingual. But those families, if you use those patterns, language choice patterns at home as parents, you have the same fairly good chance of having children who actually speak the non-school language. Now, how well they speak it, that we don't know from this survey, but that they speak it. And then we come to the next two, yellow or orange, where also, again, there's no statistical difference between 78% and 73%, where basically these two pretty opposite patterns. So in one type of family, both parents speak both languages, often thought to be of the devil, basically. That's not how you raise bilingual children. No, you've got to raise them in the next way, namely just speaking one language to your child, each parent a different one. Well, as you can see, it makes no difference in the success rate for the school, the non-school language. And this also quite clearly shows, as already earlier here in Japan, Yamamoto Masao had shown that this one parent, one language situation isn't particularly great for language transmission of the non-school language. And then we have at the very bottom, with only 34% success rate for the X language, this pattern where both parents speak the school language at home, and in addition, one parent the X language. So there you see that there is actually quite a big role for parental home language choice patterns. So to support harmonious bilingualism in the sense that children will actually speak two languages, it is really the best if both parents in bilingual settings speak the non-school language at home, and at most one parent speaks the school language as well. But of course that's not always possible, and it is not all. There are some other main controllable factors that foster bilingual children's proficient use of two languages. So here it comes to proficiency, not just yes, no, speaking or not speaking. So first of all, it's the frequency with which children hear each language is really important. Yeah, it's an important factor in all children's language acquisition. Also, the quality of child-directed speech. So how do parents speak to their children or with their children? Do they speak clearly? Do they speak with this sing-song intonation pattern when the children are very, very young? Yeah, those are just some aspects of the quality of how you speak to children. Another point is how responsive are parents to young children's questions? Do you actually answer your child's questions regularly or not? It's very important, because if you don't, your child will fall silent in a particular language, maybe, yeah? And then what's really important, of course, is the communicative, and it's all linked here, the need for children to actively use each language. If you really don't need to use a language, then you're not going to. It's very simple. And then there's also, this all hangs together because this all feeds into the opportunities for children to actually speak each language. And practice makes perfect. And also my teacher from Stanford University, Dr. Eve Clark, she has shown this also for monolingual acquisition. Children need to practice. You know, they're just starting out with language acquisition. They don't have the automatic responses that we as habitual users of language have. They still need to get into that. It has to become automatic. And so they have to be able to say the same thing and say the same thing and say the same thing and learn to say the same thing again. Practice makes perfect. Also, of course, what's really important is positive identifications with both the languages and the cultures associated with them. And please don't get me wrong, I do not equate a language with a culture. Okay, that's very clear. But in general, it helps if children are really immersed not only in a particular language, but also in cultural aspects that go with a particular language or with a particular, with a particular parent often, right? So in general, young children need sustained, frequent, and regular input in each of two languages in order to learn them and to learn to use them. And in order to support harmonious bilingualism, caregivers in bilingual families should speak to children very frequently in both languages. And parents often forget this. So how important is language input? Well, it's very well documented, and I give that review in that book, Bilingual Development in Childhood, that children who speak the language they hear more often, they speak that language better than the less frequently heard language. And book reading to children in two languages greatly supports their lexical development regardless of the general exposure. So there's really a very special place for book reading. But there's more. It doesn't stop there. In order for young children to learn to speak two languages, they must actually need to speak them. I mentioned this before, but I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit more. So to support harmonious bilingualism, caregivers, it's up to them really. I'm afraid so, you know, young parents, it's a lot of work. As also Dr. Okita wrote in her fantastic book from, I also think, 2002, on Japanese families in the United Kingdom. You know, there's a lot of work involved in supporting harmonious bilingualism. So caregivers must create a necessity or a need for children to respond in the same language that they are speaking to children. So caregivers can do so through discourse strategies, and I want to emphasize that these discourse strategies work at the conversational level, and that yes, it is possible that the same parent will speak two languages to the child, but within one conversation, it's important to keep the conversation monolingual, basically, if you're at all interested in your child speaking that particular language. So, and here we come to the importance of what's called these monolingual parental discourse strategies. These support children's use of the non-school language, which, as we've seen, is really at risk in bilingual settings, especially for BFLA children. And so these monolingual parental discourse strategies, and I'll explain in a little moment what they might be, they're the best strategies caregivers can use if children address them, so the parents, in the school language, when caregivers are speaking the non-school language to them. So for instance, here in Japan, it would be a Portuguese mother who's talking to her child in Portuguese and the child answers in Japanese. Well, if you're interested, if this mother is interested in her child speaking Portuguese, then she would do best to either ask the child for a clarification like, huh, what did you just say? Even though, as a Portuguese family or a person in Japan, by then the mother will have learned Japanese and will have possibly understood what the child said. Possibly. It doesn't really matter. I mean, this is something, requests for clarification. Those are part of normal conversational practices, even in a monolingual setting. So there are some people who say, oh no, that's like lying. No, it's not lying. In a monolingual setting also, we sometimes say, oh, excuse me, what? Even though we know that language, but we just haven't heard, we just haven't paid attention, we just didn't hear it. You know, that's all there's to it. So that's a request for clarification. So parents use a particular language. So in this example, Portuguese, to ask children to clarify their utterance. And children usually respond to this request by changing to language A. So in this case, Portuguese. And maybe they can't. And then you can also do this. You can ask the child, well, is this what you meant maybe? Through a yes and no question. So the parent uses a question in language A, so in this case in Portuguese, that translates what they thought the children intended to say. And children usually then respond in language A, but of course if it's a yes-no question, all they say is yes or no. So it doesn't really get them to actually say the word. But maybe next time they will know it, and this is a learning opportunity for them because they don't know all the words yet that they need. So this helps children. So in conclusion, the use of monolingual parental discourse strategies, combined with lots of regular and high-quality input in especially the non-school language, and positive attitudes towards all children's languages, these all greatly contribute towards children's high proficiency in 2 languages and bilingual families' experience with harmonious bilingualism. And with this, arigato, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much.